So now we've talked about project management framework, and next we're going to talk about project management processes. So lesson 4, are we ready to go on?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to describe the process group interactions. We're going to recognize how these are aligned with the knowledge areas, and we're going to look at the inputs and the actions of the project management process groups. So again, and this is key to understand so that you can fill out your application form to take the exam. And again, I'm very willing to help and you know, take emails or whatever as you fill out that examination application. Okay, so we've got our 5: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. So hopefully you'll know this backwards, forwards, upside down by the end of today. And again, the iteration among the various different process groups depends on the life cycle style of the organization and the organization of the organization itself. And again, they may iterate once, or they may iterate or have a tight circle you can see in the middle between planning and executing multiple times. So again, we look at the process map, which is from page 25 of the PMBOK, and make sure that you understand where the various processes go, you know, which areas they belong to. So reading a process diagram, if you look at this as a process diagram, on the left you have inputs from other knowledge areas, and you notice our EEFs and OPAs. So we're almost always going to have those because they almost always play a role in the 49 processes. And then in the box which actually names the process itself, you're going to have inputs from that same knowledge area, and then as outputs you're going to have things that contribute to further knowledge areas. And during the scope of the process itself, you're going to apply tools and techniques, and expert judgment gets applied a lot. Obviously, as a project manager, you want to put your brain in the loop, but you also have facilitation techniques, for instance, in this project integration management process. So there's a color scheme, and this is just a Sprintzeal color scheme and not key fundamental to PMI, but that initiating is in gold, planning is in blue, executing is kind of in that orangey red, monitoring and controlling is sort of a greenish, and then closing is in gray. So the initiating process group starts something new, and it establishes the vision and the potential hope for outcomes. So again, the project is officially authorized when the charter is approved by the sponsor. So the inputs you'd have include the statement of work, which you may get if it's an internal project from a part of your organization. If it's a contract that you bid on, it's that statement of work that the contractor letting the task is putting forth. And then any agreements you may have, existing agreements with subcontractors, a business case. So if this is an internal project, you have the business case. If you're doing the project for an external organization, they've developed a business case as to why it's needed. And then we've got our external enterprise environmental factors, and we've got our internal organizational process assets, which play a role in how we view and characterize staff and put resources to a project. And then we've got any procurement documents that may be necessary. And then a number of actions could be taken to perform the project assessment with key stakeholders. Assumptions and constraints are very big to PMI, and in fact that's where the predominant risk areas are found, because anytime you assume something or put something on the project as a constraint, anytime those change, obviously that introduces risks, because then one of your base assumptions is no longer true, or is potentially different. Again, you want to deliver identify deliverables to achieve the goals. You want to do stakeholder analysis to align expectations, because again, you need to keep that ongoing support, whether it is from higher up in the organization, maybe even peer project managers, and as well as the potential customer base. Then you want to identify high-risk items and propose implementation strategies. You want to look at the project charter development, again, because you've got to get the stakeholders on board, and you want to obtain their authority and commitment to continue with this project. And remember, we talked about a wide range of stakeholders, and we'll delve into stakeholders deeply at the very end of the course. And then we want to perform benefit analysis to align organizational strategy and business value, and we want to facilitate stakeholder communications about the elements of the project charter, because the project charter is basically the document that leads your project. Usually the project charter stays not exactly set in stone, but it's usually cast.
Well, I know it's signed, and I know there could be an addendum.
Right. So it's cast at a high enough level that the fundamental principle should not change. But you're right. If something fundamentally changes, then you need to have an addendum.
Yep.
And so, and because of that signature process, obviously you need the key people to sign it. And if personnel change, you may need to have the new personnel who come in.
It guides the project unless there's some type of written change. That is how the project is handled.
Right. Right. So that, and again, it necessarily needs to stay at a relatively high level. Okay, so next we're going to talk about project initiation, and I kind of tipped this a little bit yesterday about the ability of stakeholders to influence the final characteristics of the project. So the cost of change, if you look at the red line, starts fairly low and gets fairly high, and if you look at the blue line, the opportunity for influence by stakeholders starts pretty high and rapidly declines and gets pretty low, because obviously, say if you've laid a foundation, then that characterizes the building. It determines how many stories can be built upon that foundation. It characterizes how many square feet can be built, no matter how high you build up. But it gives you it kind of starts to lock you in terms of future changes. So the farther along you go, the more expensive it'll be to impact change. So stakeholders, that's why you want all your stakeholders available and on board at the beginning, because ultimately they will be happy with the results that they had influence on. If some stakeholder comes in, say in the middle where those lines cross, their ability to fundamentally change the project will be significantly lessened. That's where you might have an addition to the project or an addendum to the project charter. Okay, so next we're going to talk about planning. And the planning process group establishes the total scope of the effort, the objectives, and the course of action required to attain objectives. So the inputs to planning are the project charter. Remember, we talked about that as being fairly high level. These are requirements given by the customer, so we want to make sure that we obtain all of the customer requirements, or to the extent that we can obtain all of the requirements. The stakeholder register, which we'll talk about much later in the course. The stakeholder management strategy, again, it's very important and obviously a very upfront thing to do, but stakeholders didn't take on their own knowledge area till about PMBOK 4. And then we've got our enterprise environmental factors, and remember, are those internal or external?
I'm sorry.
Okay. Enterprise environmental factors.
Well, that is both. Well, it's external and
correct.
internal.
Well, the enterprise environmental factors, now those are all the external ones.
Okay. That's culture, environment, everything else.
Correct. And then you've got teaming agreements, and then you've got resource calendars. So, for instance, if you've got a fleet of trucks, when are those trucks available? When are they jobbed out to other tasks? So you've got to make sure for both your human and your material resources, how are they available? And even money can be considered a resource. You know, as I'll say a million times, the money truck doesn't back up day one with $100 million on the first day of the project. It's usually, you know, allocated in smaller increments. So nobody runs off to, you know, Columbia with all of it.
That's
So
right.
the actions taken include refining requirements, getting stakeholder buy-in, developing the baseline scope, cost, and schedule. And remember, you've got a high-level scope, cost, and schedule in the project charter, but very high. And then ideally you get to select the project team and determine the roles and responsibilities, define the quality standards and plan. And in general, when PMI talks about quality, the definition is conformance to requirements. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about the word quality. Again, we want to have a framework for risk management, identification, analysis, and risk response planning. And again, that'll be talked about much later. But as a knowledge area, it's not temporally later, it's just that the order that PMI thought of these knowledge areas.
Okay.
Again, we need to determine what needs to be purchased, how to execute and control the project, how to document the project management plan, and handle any updates arising out of change requests. And remember, we've got to have a well-defined change control process so that everyone is singing from the same sheet of music. Okay, so project planning. Project planning has 6 primary functions. One is translating the needs into manageable risks, defining the required resources, organizing and coordinating project teamwork, identifying and evaluating risks, establishing processes, practices, and procedures, and defining the measures of project success. So you definitely want to make sure that the stakeholders have input into the definition of project success so that when you get to the end, the deliverables are accepted and the stakeholders are happy with the deliverables. And so that, you know, that at some point during the project, they don't say, oh, wait a second, you know, I was thinking that phone would be small enough to fit, you know, in my shirt pocket, and all of a sudden you've got it big enough that I can, you know, watch, you know, all aspects of an NFL game or something. So again, planning is important to the PMI process, but again, if you have a more agile or spiral type of life cycle, you might plan a little, build a little, test a little, evaluate a little, and then iterate. Okay, the executing process group, and remember again that these aren't necessarily temporal in nature, they just, you know, that, but we've got it, we can't talk about them all at the same time. So the executing process group completes the work defined in the plan to satisfy the project specifications. And so we've got inputs that we've predominantly already talked about, and that we will talk about at further length later in the course, like make or buy decisions when we talk about procurement management and source selection criteria. And there we have our work performance report and our work performance information. Remember that we devised from work performance data.
Yeah.
And then we've got, question?
Nope.
Okay, and then we've got the actions that the team that's working on the project takes, including managing the stakeholder engagements, delivering the work packages as planned, and we'll talk about exactly the definition of work package, which is one of the smallest levels to which we decompose our work breakdown structure. We'll implement quality assurance, we'll produce the reports, and the job, this is one of the big jobs of a project manager, is to remove project bottlenecks, to clear the path, to make it easy for the team to move forward. Again, organizing team building activities, training for the new team members, progress meetings, and implement the approved changes, corrective actions, preventative actions, and defect repair, and finalize procurement arrangements and contracts. So when you're filling out your application, think about these kinds of actions taken, and when you characterize your experience in the executing process group, It should be these kinds of actions and not the actual, I put fingers to keyboard and created code, or I welded part A to part B, because that's not the project management part of the executing process group. Okay, and then the monitoring and controlling, and remember, this is a large overarching and a heavy hitter for the project manager. And again, this identifies what data needs to be kept. Obviously, you can't keep everything, and how it's kept and how it's used to further the goals of the project. So again, we have our inputs, and here we have our OPAs. And remember, the OPAs are what kind of assets?
The OPAs, that's the
organizational process assets.
Oh,
those are
okay.
internal or external?
That's internal.
Perfect. And then, again, the actions taken in the monitoring and controlling process group are those that you want to emphasize in your application, measuring against the performance baseline. So that's why you set up baselines, so that you can measure against them. Again, look at the variances and recommend changes and corrective actions, resolve conflicts, identify the root cause of problems. And if you could mark on this PDF, I would say underline and bold and highlight that, because PMI is very concerned with getting to the root cause of a problem as quickly as possible and solving the right problem. In other words, getting to the heart of the matter and getting it fixed, and fixed for all times. Not just putting a Band-Aid on it and moving on. Again, obtaining formal acceptance for deliverables, administering contracts, controlling changes. And again, changes have to be very carefully controlled so that the project charter is still in force and you're still within the realm of the project that project charter describes. And then conducting status review meetings. Okay, last but not least is the closing process group. And there are probably more words here than there are about the process in the closing process group, which is the only, because now it's down to one process. So basically what goes into closing are the documents, the accepted deliverables, the OPAs, and the EEFs. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that all the requirements are met. You want to get customer sign-off. You make payment to all parties and update the cost records. Close the contract, update the lessons learned database, and then you want to, ideally measure customer satisfaction to determine how well you did in terms of lessons learned. Hand over the project deliverables to the operations team, and then release the resources. So depending on your type of organization, releasing the resources can be either very tumultuous time because people have nowhere to go, or they just go back into their functional organization.